here is Brit Hume on Fox saying, well, basically, considering the entire population of America is really just synonymous with Fox viewers in his mind.
Well, I think, Ben, that a great many Americans, if not a distinct majority, would listen to what President Biden said, saying that George Floyd's death was an example of systemic racism, and be dubious. I don't think Americans mostly think our country is systemically racist. I think most Americans believe that it once was systemically racist, particularly back in the days of slavery, but even beyond that, in the period that followed up until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, when blacks were clearly subjugated, were treated as less than full citizens, were discriminated against in a multitude of ways. But the Civil Rights Movement was one of the great successes in American history. It awakened the conscience of a nation to the injustices that prevailed at the time, and huge strides were made legislatively and otherwise to overcome that. Indeed, you might ask the question, Ben, whether any nation on earth has ever made more strenuous efforts to overcome racial discrimination than this nation has. And, you know, one of the great tragedies, in my view, of this whole situation we have here is that perhaps the greatest achievement of the Civil Rights Movement is a nearly unanimous consensus in America against racism. Being called a racist and being shown to be a racist is about the worst thing that can happen to you. But unfortunately, that's been weaponized now, and the term is flung about with abandon by politicians and others. And I don't think we are a racist country in anything like the way we were once before. So I think this situation we confront now is where you see politicians and others who wanted to appear that everything that's happened so far is not enough, and maybe it's not, but every step, of course, everything that's done to do better is merely a first step. Because I think the truth is that there is advantage to be had in waving the banner of racism.
If Brit Hume had been alive, or if there was an equivalent of Fox News back in, say, the 1960s, and he was doing the same thing he's doing now, he would have said that he doesn't understand what all the hubbubaloo about, civil rights is, because racism ended when slavery did.
Right. Well, first off, and it's not, it's not just Brit Hume. Barry Weiss, I think, had something to this effect the other day, too. The idea that because our government, just our government, specifically stopped having laws that were racist or practices that were racist, and I'm talking the federal government, does not mean that we don't still have systemic racism. And in terms of governments, I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. Even this Supreme Court has rejected laws that were passed to restrict voting because they were racist. They were passed by governments, state governments. And we have changes in, we're just talking now institutional racism. We're talking literally governmental racism, as opposed to systemic racism, which is far broader. It involves society. It involves private institutions. And I mean, look, the fact is that if I say to you, like, okay, you and I, we're going to start, you've got a ball and chain around your leg, but we're going to start at the same place and go. No more of that. Or we run that race for a day and I am 25 miles ahead of you. And I say, okay, well, you know what? Now we're going to make things fair. You don't have that ball and chain on you anymore. And let's start the race. Well, I'm still 25 miles ahead of you. Yeah. And so systemically, just the idea that I would make no reparation for that time in which you were held down in and of itself is systemically racist if it is done based upon, if it is a function of race. I mean, so this argument that this argument that there is no more systemic racism anymore. There's just, a couple of races here and there, and that systemically there's no issue is, it's fascinating to see them hang
It's
their
in
heads
and
up.
of itself a reflection of systemic racism.
Yes.
And they would have made, the Brit Humes of the world would have made the same arguments back in the day, every step of the way. It's just a few bad racists. It's not everybody. It's not all of the plantation slave owners. It's just a few of them that kind of whip them a little bit too hard. It's the same desire to deflect from systemic critique because they are not interested in systemic overhaul, and so they have to make excuses and bend over backwards in order to justify their own individually racist views, because that's the irony of it all, that Brit Hume is a racist.
Well,
so that's why he has to deny the existence of systemic racism, even though on the individual level, there you go, buddy, look in the mirror.
And of course, it always functions ultimately. The people calling out the notion of systemic racism or belief in systemic racism ends up really, really ultimately being oppression of, he says, Americans, but it's really, because when he says it's being weaponized, who's it being weaponized against?
Yeah, it's really
being weaponized against Americans who in his mind are white people.
It's the 78-year-old Fox viewer at the golf course, in between holes at the clubhouse,
being completely
drinking a martini, like, yeah,
oppressed,
right?
Being completely
I'm oppressed.
Yes, that's ultimately where all this leads. Is that it's really just the calling out of racism is ultimately a method of oppressing white people.
Would he, maybe he would say it's systemic oppression against white people that individuals are being called out in the media. That's his individual white people being called out in the media for racism is systemic racism against white people by the government. There you go.